Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, it feels engineered. We really crave that kind of visibility.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points a pen at it and says, there's the problem.
It's incredibly binary, broken or not broken. You can point right to the physical failure.
But the moment you step into the world of human memory, that metaphorical x-ray machine just shatters. We are suddenly looking at a cognitive landscape that is incredibly murky.
Oh, absolutely. And it's highly resistant to that kind of simple binary diagnosis,
Yeah, and because of that, most of us walk around treating our memory like it's this static metal filing cabinet inside our heads.
which is such a pervasive cultural assumption. We think you're either born with a massive, perfectly organized mahogany cabinet or
Or you're born with a tiny rusty one where the drawers constantly get stuck and files just vanish into thin air.
right. And that is a completely limiting myth. It implies your memory capacity is this fixed trait decided by genetics at birth.
Like whatever cognitive hand you were dealt is the one you just have to play for the rest of your life.
Exactly. But the stack of sources we are looking at today fundamentally dismantles that filing cabinet analogy.
It really does. I mean, we're looking at clinical research, cognitive training manuals, neurological studies, and they reframe memory entirely.
It is not a static box. It is a living, breathing muscle.
Yeah, it's a highly adaptable biological system that radically changes its physical structure based on the environment you put it in.
And today, we aren't talking about treating that system with basic flashcards or mnemonic tricks to, awkwardly organize a rusty cabinet.
No, not at all. The sources we've pulled, including deep dives into texts like Keep Your Brain Alive, Total Memory Workout, and the Working Memory Advantage, they point towards something much deeper.
We are hacking the brain's internal software and physically rewiring the hardware.
Right. We're looking at the holistic, unexpected, and sometimes wonderfully bizarre methods that dictate how memory functions on a cellular level. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, to understand how to rebuild that system, we have to start at the very edge of the process, the gatekeeper of all human experience.
Okay, let's unpack this. What is the gatekeeper?
If we want to understand why we forget things, we actually have to look at the precise mechanics of how we pay attention.
Ah, right. The texts highlight this pervasive systemic problem in our modern neurology, which they classify as mindlessness.
And that term is so evocative because it describes a universal human glitch.
It really does. The texts describe this state perfectly. It's like you're driving home from work, you pull into your driveway, turn off the engine, and you suddenly realize you have absolutely no memory of the last 20 minutes.
The route, the traffic lights, the turns, it's just a complete void.
Or you're sitting on the couch reading a book, your eyes physically scan every single word on the page, you get to the bottom, and you realize you have retained 0% of the information.
We've all been there. And the immediate reaction most people have in those moments is a spike of fear. They think, my memory is failing.
Right, like early onset something or other.
Exactly. But the clinical reality is much different. The reason you can't remember the drive or the text on the page isn't because your memory mechanism failed to retrieve the information.
Oh, because the memory was never created in the first place.
Yes, it wasn't that the file was lost. The file was never saved to the hard drive.
It wasn't even typed out.
Exactly.
Mm.
In the scientific community, the very first stage of the memory process is called encoding.
And encoding is basically the biological translation process, right?
Yeah, it's how raw sensory input, so the photons hitting your retina, the sound waves hitting your eardrums, is converted into an electrical and chemical format.
A format that the brain's neural networks can actually process and store.
But the critical rule of encoding, the absolute biological bottleneck, is that without focus, there is no encoding.
One of the medical texts actually uses the word juice, like focus provides the electrochemical juice the brain requires to fuel that translation process.
I love that term. Because when you are in that state of mindlessness, operating purely on automated neurological autopilot, the brain is scanning the environment and making a choice.
It's basically deciding there is nothing novel or threatening happening here, so I am not going to expend precious metabolic energy saving this data.
Right, because the brain is a massive energy miser. It consumes roughly 20% of our body's calories, despite being a tiny fraction of our mass.
So it just refuses to record data unless you consciously signal that the data matters.
Exactly. Without encoding, there is no storage. And without storage, there is no retrieval.
Which brings us to the antidote presented in the research, which is mindfulness. And I want to be careful here because mindfulness has become this sort of diluted corporate buzzword.
Yeah, like something you do on a company retreat. But in the context of cognitive neurology, the text defined mindfulness as bringing acute, intentional awareness to the present physical moment.
Right. It is the active muscular process of pulling your consciousness away from ruminating on past regrets or simulating future anxieties.
And anchoring it to the sensory reality of right now.
The impact of that anchoring on the brain's working memory is profound. So, working memory is basically your brain's short-term workspace.
Right. Think of it as the loading dock. It's where new information sits temporarily before it either decays into nothingness or gets passed into the hippocampus for long-term storage.
And that loading dock is shockingly small. The classic psychological metric cited in the texts is that the average human adult can only hold about 7 distinct items in their working memory at any given time.
Yeah, that's actually the origin of the 7-digit phone number. It is the absolute bottleneck of human consciousness.
So if you try to hold 8 or 9 items, the first few just get pushed off the loading dock and are lost forever.
Exactly. However, the research shows that the physical practice of mindfulness is scientifically proven to strengthen the efficiency of that workspace.
Meaning you are training the brain's networks to allocate its limited resources with laser precision.
Yes. The sources dive into the actual neurological architecture behind this attention mechanism, specifically outlining 2 opposing systems, the TPN and the TNN.
Okay, the task-positive network and the task-negative network. Understanding this push-pull dynamic fundamentally changes how we view human attention.
It really does. The TPN, the task-positive network, lights up in fMRI scans when you are highly engaged in a demanding task that requires extreme, outward-focused concentration.
Like if I am trying to thread a tiny needle or trying to merge onto a busy highway in blinding rain, my TPN is completely dominant.
Right. You are locked into the external environment. In those moments, your brain is suppressing all internal distractions to keep you alive and successful.
But the brain cannot sustain that level of metabolic burn indefinitely, can it?
No, it would burn out. That leads us to the TNN, the task-negative network. This network activates when you step away from demanding external tasks.
It is your brain's default mode. It governs involuntary actions, mind-wandering, daydreaming, and internal reflection.
So a healthy cognitive system is supposed to operate like a pendulum, swinging harmoniously between the two.
When you need to encode critical information, the TPN engages. When the task is done, the pendulum swings to the TNN so the system can rest, regenerate, and process what just happened.
They operate antagonistically. When one is highly active, the other goes quiet.
The dysfunction occurs when that pendulum gets stuck or hijacked.
Exactly. If you force yourself to stay in the TPN for hours on end, say staring at a spreadsheet without a break, you experience cognitive fatigue.
The juice runs out, and your ability to encode new memories plummets.
But the opposite is equally damaging. If your pendulum swings into the TNN for a break, but your internal default mode is dominated by chronic stress, financial anxiety, and the endless digital chatter of notifications, you never actually rest.
Right, your mind wandering isn't restorative, it's a chaotic spiral. Your TNN just becomes the storm of stressful rumination.
And that is precisely where mindfulness intervenes. Mindfulness acts as the regulatory mechanism for the pendulum.
So it trains your brain to sustain the TPN when you actually need to learn something.
And crucially, it trains you to find stillness within the TNN when you need to recharge, preventing the anxiety spiral from depleting your cognitive reserves.
There is a beautiful piece of imagery in the text that crystallizes this. They suggest that if human consciousness is a fast-moving stream that occasionally turns into violent rapids.
Mindfulness is the act of stepping out of the water and standing on the riverbank.
Exactly. The water is still rushing by, the intrusive thoughts, the work deadlines, the environmental noise, but you are no longer drowning in the current.
You are observing the flow from a place of dry detachment. That visual perfectly captures the separation of the observer from the thought.
You realize that you are not the anxiety, you are the system experiencing the anxiety.
Exactly.
Wait, if the brain is an energy hog that desperately needs to conserve calories, isn't it exhausting to be hyper-aware of every single thing happening around you constantly?
That's a really common concern.
I mean, if mindfulness is standing on the riverbank analyzing every leaf and twig that floats past, how does the brain ever get the biological downtime it requires? Doesn't the autopilot mechanism exist for a valid evolutionary reason?
That is a critical distinction to make and a very common misinterpretation of the practice. Mindfulness is absolutely not about adopting a state of exhausting hypervigilance.
Okay, phew, because that sounds awful.
You aren't meant to walk through life analyzing the exact thread count of the carpet or focusing on the precise acoustic frequency of your air conditioner. That would lead to massive sensory overload and instant burnout.
Right, so the autopilot feature is evolutionarily necessary for survival.
Yes, so it's not about turning the autopilot off permanently. It is about intentionality.
So it's knowing when to use it.
Exactly. Mindfulness is the cultivated awareness that allows you to choose when the autopilot is engaged. It is the ability to recognize when you have slipped into a mindless state during a moment that actually matters.
Like if you are having a conversation with your partner and you realize you haven't heard a word they said for 2 minutes because you were worrying about an email.
Yes. Mindfulness is the tool that lets you catch the glitch, step out of the rumination, and intentionally choose to encode the conversation.
You can still let your mind wander. You can still daydream. But mindfulness ensures that when you choose to focus, you actually have the steering wheel in your hands.
So it's a curation game. It's the difference between intentionally deciding to watch a movie to let your brain relax versus falling into a doom-scrolling trance on your phone for 3 hours and coming out of it feeling completely drained.
One is an intentional use of the TNN for rest. The other is passive consumption that actively blocks meaningful memory creation.
And that curation preserves the neurochemical resources your brain desperately needs to build strong, resilient memories later in the day.
Okay, so if mindfulness is the act of stepping onto the riverbank to observe the rapids, the transition into the actual practice of meditation is like training the brain to build a massive concrete dam.
I like that. It takes that baseline awareness and subjects it to intensive physical conditioning.
We move from observing the hardware to actively altering its physical structure. The research shifts its focus heavily toward the destructive capability of stress here, positioning it as the ultimate antagonist to memory retention.
And the texts don't mince words. They call stress the brain's worst enemy.
Yeah, it's not framed as just a psychological burden or a bad mood. The sources detail how chronic stress is a physical neurotoxin that literally destroys brain cells and cripples the machinery of memory.
To understand the destruction, we have to look at the endocrine system. When you perceive a threat, whether that is a physical predator or a looming deadline at work, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, kicks into gear.
And it floods your bloodstream with cortisol.
Right. In short, acute bursts. Cortisol is a brilliant survival mechanism. It accelerates your heart rate, shunts blood to your muscles, and hyperfocuses your attention to survive the immediate danger.
But the human body wasn't designed to bathe in cortisol for weeks on end because of a mortgage payment.
No, it really wasn't. When cortisol exposure becomes chronic, it becomes highly toxic, specifically to the hippocampus.
The hippocampus is that seahorse-shaped structure nestled deep in the temporal lobe, right? And it acts as the primary sorting facility for memory.
Exactly. It decides what information from the working memory gets committed to long-term vault. Chronic cortisol overexcites the neurons in the hippocampus.
If I'm understanding the neurobiology described in the sources, this overexcitement isn't just making the cells work faster, it's causing a phenomenon called excitotoxicity.
Yes. The cortisol causes the neurons to absorb too much calcium, and they essentially fire themselves to death.
They literally self-destruct.
Over time, prolonged stress physically shrinks the mass of the hippocampus.
Yeah.
You are losing the very hardware required to remember your life.
Wow, that is terrifying. It's a physical erosion of identity.
It is. But the antidote, the regenerative protocol detailed in the research, is meditation. And the clinical studies they cite to prove this are astounding.
The foundational one we need to look at is the University of Wisconsin-Madison study conducted by Richard Davidson.
Davidson's methodology was brilliant because he didn't just want to see what a calm brain looked like. He wanted to see what meditation does to the brain's architecture under extreme hostile pressure.
So he assembled two distinct cohorts. The first group consisted of expert meditators. These were individuals, many of them monks, with over 37,000 hours of formal meditation practice.
Just to put that number in perspective, 37,000 hours is roughly 4.5 straight years of sitting in unbroken conscious meditation.
These are the absolute apex predators of mindfulness.
Truly. The second group were complete novices, individuals with no prior meditation experience. Davidson placed participants from both groups into an fMRI scanner.
For anyone who hasn't been in one, an fMRI is already a highly stressful environment. It is a claustrophobic, incredibly loud, magnetic tube that clangs like a jackhammer.
And Davidson didn't just let them sit there in the noise. He actively attacked their attention.
While they were in the tube, instructed to focus purely on their breath, he blasted their headphones with jarring, emotionally distressing audio.
The texts specify the sounds: chaotic restaurant noise, a baby cooing, and suddenly the piercing sound of a woman screaming in terror.
It is the ultimate stress test, designed to violently hijack the brain's attention networks and trigger a massive amygdala response.
The amygdala being the brain's primal threat detector.
The data from those scans paint such a clear picture of cognitive armor. When the novices heard the screaming, their fMRI scans lit up like a Christmas tree in the emotional and reactive centers of the brain.
Their attention was completely shattered. The working memory workspace was flooded with panic and distraction. They lost their focus entirely.
But the expert meditators exhibited a radically different neurological response. They heard the exact same terrifying audio, but they were remarkably adept at filtering it out.
The fMRI revealed massive, sustained activation in their prefrontal cortex, or the PFC.
The PFC being the evolutionary newest part of the brain, sitting right behind the forehead. It's the CEO. It governs executive function, high-order logical thinking, and the management of the working memory workspace.
The expert meditators were utilizing their hyper-developed PFC to act like an acoustic dampener.
The PFC sent inhibitory signals down to the amygdala, essentially saying, I hear the noise, I acknowledge the sensory input, but I am choosing not to let it hijack the working memory.
They maintained absolute, unbroken focus on their breath despite the chaos. What's fascinating here is how tangible that control is on a screen.
Which is an incredible superpower, but I can hear the immediate skepticism. Someone listening right now is thinking, sure, if I abandon my life and meditate in a cave for 37,000 hours, I can block out a screaming woman too.
Right, they're thinking they don't have time for that.
Yeah, I have a 9-to-5 job, a family, and endless responsibilities. I don't have 4 years to build a titanium prefrontal cortex. The applicability feels out of reach.
The researchers anticipated that exact critique, which is why the texts paired Davidson's work with a study by Amishi Jha at the University of Pennsylvania.
Jha's research grounds this neuroplasticity in brutal, everyday reality. She didn't study monks, she studied United States Marines.
And not just any Marines, but combat personnel in the intense, high-stakes pre-deployment phase.
You cannot design a more cortisol-drenched, high-anxiety environment than soldiers anticipating a combat deployment. The disrupted sleep, the physical toll, the psychological weight, they are swimming in stress hormones.
Jha divided these Marines into 2 distinct groups to measure the dose response of meditation. Group A was instructed to practice mindfulness meditation for 30 minutes every single day for 8 weeks.
Group B, the control, was given a much lighter load. They meditated for just 20 minutes a week for those same 8 weeks.
A daily, rigorous practice versus a casual, almost negligible check-in. At the end of the 8-week period, she ran a battery of tests measuring their working memory capacity and their overall mood.
The results were highly specific. Group B, the casual meditators, saw their working memory degrade under the crushing stress of the impending deployment. The cortisol was actively shrinking their capacity.
But Group A, the 30-minute-a-day group, not only protected their baseline, they actually showed significantly higher working memory scores than when they started.
And alongside the cognitive boost, they reported vastly improved positive moods, despite the exact same external threat looming over them.
The connection Jha makes here between mood and memory capacity is the most crucial insight. It is not a linear equation where meditation makes you feel calm, and therefore your memory magically works better.
It is a highly mechanical feedback loop. The physical strengthening of the working memory is the actual mechanism that creates the positive mood.
Because if your working memory is weak and your loading dock is tiny, every single anxious thought, every fear about deployment, or every worry about a mortgage payment easily forces its way onto the dock.
It occupies all the space. You lack the cognitive bandwidth to push the intrusive thoughts away, so you become the anxiety.
Conversely, if you have spent 30 minutes a day physically expanding and reinforcing that working memory space, thickening the neural pathways of the prefrontal cortex, you possess the cognitive strength to filter the inputs.
You can observe the anxious thought arriving, recognize it, and actively choose to deny it entry into your active workspace. You maintain control over what you process.
It's a biological shield, and it creates this upward spiral of brain health.
The meditation strengthens the PFC. The strong PFC filters out the stressful thoughts. Fewer stressful thoughts mean less cortisol flooding the system.
Less cortisol means the hippocampus can actually repair and grow. A larger hippocampus means better memory encoding, which feeds right back into a stronger, more efficient brain.
If we pull back and look at the broader implications, this research frames our modern society perfectly. We aren't trapped in an MRI tube listening to alarms, and most of us aren't facing military deployment.
But we exist in an attention economy that is algorithmically engineered to trigger our fight-or-flight response constantly.
The endless notifications, the 24-hour outrage news cycle, the social media platforms, they are the modern equivalent of the distracting noise in the scanner.
Our baseline psychological environment is one of severe cognitive overload, which means, based on these sources, meditation is no longer just a spiritual luxury or a relaxing hobby.
It is a biological necessity. It is the required daily maintenance to build the cognitive armor necessary to protect our memory from the toxic environment we live in.
It clears the static and protects the existing hardware. But as the cognitive training manuals make very clear, simply protecting the brain from stress is plain defense.
If we want a phenomenal memory, we have to play offense. We have to actively force the brain to build thicker, denser, faster neural pathways.
We have to take the brain to the gym. And this introduces a methodology that I found endlessly fascinating, largely because it completely attends what we've been told about brain training for decades.
The texts dive deep into the science of neurobics.
The term was coined by neurobiologist Lawrence Katz and Manning Rubin. It is a fusion of neurons and aerobics, and it targets a massive blind spot in conventional cognitive advice.
For as long as I can remember, the standard advice for keeping your brain sharp as you age was to do crossword puzzles, play Sudoku, or engage in logic games.
The idea was that mental effort equals mental growth.
Right. Katz and Rubin argue that while those activities are perfectly fine, they represent a highly limited, specialized workout. They refer to it as the Sudoku trap.
If you sit down and complete a crossword puzzle every single morning for 20 years, your brain is absolutely not growing anymore.
The first few weeks, perhaps, but eventually, you are just incredibly efficient at the highly specific solitary routine of solving crosswords.
You've built a neural superhighway for that one specific task, and the brain is essentially coasting on autopilot while you do it. It requires very little metabolic energy or new growth.
Neurobics approaches brain health from the opposite direction. The core philosophy is the intentional disruption of routine by forcing the brain to integrate the 5 physical senses.
Sight, sound, touch, smell, taste.
Exactly. Integrating them alongside emotional resonance in entirely novel and unexpected contexts. It is the science of surprise.
The practical applications they suggest are brilliant because they take mundane daily tasks and turn them into massive neurological workouts.
The classic example they outline is brushing your teeth. But instead of using your dominant hand, you use your non-dominant hand.
Which sounds incredibly simple, but the biology of what is happening under the skull is explosive.
When you use your dominant hand to brush your teeth, the neural pathway coordinating that complex motor function is deeply myelinated. It is a slick fast track. Your brain devotes almost zero conscious processing power to the action.
But the morning you switch the toothbrush to your left hand, chaos ensues in the motor cortex.
The entire opposite hemisphere of your brain, which normally stays dormant during this routine, suddenly has to wake up.
It has to rapidly fire new signals, coordinate unfamiliar spatial awareness, and direct a complex sequence of micro-movements it usually ignores.
You are physically forcing the brain to awaken dormant networks and forge new synaptic connections just to get the toothpaste to your mouth.
Another brilliant exercise is getting dressed for work with your eyes closed. We are overwhelmingly visual creatures.
Our brains rely heavily on sight to navigate our environment, establishing deep visual routines. By intentionally removing vision from the equation, you force a massive rerouting of sensory processing.
Without sight, the brain has to lean entirely on tactile and spatial feedback. You become acutely aware of the texture of the fabric, the temperature of the air, the exact proprioceptive location of your limbs in space.
You are asking completely different neural networks to solve a problem they aren't used to solving.
The sources outline so many of these disruptions. Eating dinner with your family in total, absolute silence.
It strips away the auditory distraction of conversation and forces your brain to hyper-focus on the taste, the smell, and the physical texture of the food.
While demanding that you communicate through novel nonverbal cues, or changing the physical route you walk your dog.
Spatial mapping is incredibly resource-intensive for the brain. When you drive the same route to work every day, Your hippocampus has that map permanently locked in. You can drive for miles without consciously seeing the road.
But when you force yourself down a new street, the hippocampus has to rapidly process novel spatial data, track new landmarks, and calculate new trajectories. It shocks the system out of its energy-saving mode.
They also talk about a concept called the sensory symphony, which is taking a routine, relaxing activity, like taking a bath, and intentionally overloading it with varied sensory inputs.
You don't just sit in the water. You light specific aromatic candles, you play a highly specific genre of music, you drink a particular flavor of tea.
And alongside neurobics, the texts introduce the concept of mental yoga. This is the practice of using physical locations as hardwired anchors for specific mental and emotional states.
The brain is incredibly context-dependent. If you work from home and you answer stressful emails from your bed, your brain associates the physical space of the bed with cortisol and anxiety, which ruins your sleep.
Mental yoga is the intentional separation of those spaces. You create one specific chair in your house where you only ever read for pleasure. You create a separate desk where you only ever pay bills.
You are training the neural networks to instantly snap into a desired state, relaxation, or focus based entirely on the physical environment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to pause here and dig into the cellular biology of why neurobics actually improves memory, because the mechanism is fascinating.
It really is. The sources explain that when we force the brain to process these novel multisensory activities, the nerve cells experience a surge of electrical activity.
This activity causes the cells to secrete highly potent natural brain nutrients called neurotrophins.
The most famous of these is BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of neurotrophins not just as fertilizer, but as the chemical signal that dispatches an architectural construction crew into the brain.
When the brain gets flooded with neurotrophins, it directly stimulates the growth and complexity of dendrites.
Dendrites are the sprawling, branch-like structures extending from the body of the nerve cell. They reach out and form synaptic connections with other neurons.
The more dendrites you have, the denser the forest of connections, and the faster your brain can route information.
And this dense dendritic forest is the physical foundation for the most compelling argument in the neurobic literature, the concept of the safety net.
To understand the safety net, we have to realize that a memory is not a single file stored in a single neuron. A memory is a constellation of associations distributed across the brain.
Right. When you remember a beach vacation, the visual of the ocean is stored in the occipital lobe, the sound of the waves is in the temporal lobe, the emotional joy is in the amygdala.
Exactly. When you intentionally combine senses during a neurobic exercise, for example, if you make a conscious effort to smell a specific vanilla candle while listening to a specific jazz album, you are forging multiple distinct physical pathways to the exact same memory.
You have an auditory road, an olfactory road, and a visual road, all leading to the same destination. You are building a cognitive safety net.
Because as we age, or as we experience stress, certain neural pathways naturally degrade.
If you only have one single visual pathway linking you to a memory, and that specific pathway weakens, the memory is lost forever. It falls through the net.
But if you have spent your life engaging in multisensory neurobics, you have built massive cognitive reserve. If the visual pathway degrades, the brain simply reroutes the retrieval signal down the olfactory pathway or the auditory pathway.
The memory remains intact because you built backup infrastructure.
Hold on, if the goal here is simply to blast the brain with massive multisensory stimulation to trigger the release of these neurotrophins, why can't I just go down to the local IMAX theater, sit in the very front row, and watch an incredibly loud, visually chaotic 3-hour action movie?
That's a logical jump to make.
Right. Wouldn't the massive explosions and surround sound flood my auditory and visual networks far more than brushing my teeth with my left hand? Why isn't a blockbuster movie considered a neurobic workout?
That is the exact trap of modern entertainment, and it highlights the crucial biological distinction between passive consumption and active integration.
Walk me through the difference at the cellular level.
When you're sitting in the IMAX theater, your sensory organs are absolutely being bombarded with data, but the experience is entirely passive. The movie is doing all the heavy lifting.
You are not required to solve a problem.
No, you are not interacting with the environment, and crucially, you are not forced to combine your senses. in a novel way to navigate a challenge.
You were just a sponge absorbing the light and sound.
Exactly. And because the brain is that evolutionary energy miser we discussed earlier, it realizes very quickly that no active processing is required to survive the movie theater.
It doesn't need to build new roads because you aren't going anywhere.
Passive consumption does not trigger the release of neurotrophins. For an activity to be truly neurobic, it must demand your active participation.
It must be non-routine, unexpected, and challenging enough to force the brain out of autopilot.
Brushing your teeth with your left hand is a quiet, boring activity compared to an IMAX movie, but it demands 1,000 times more active motor planning and spatial calculation.
That makes perfect sense. The brain refuses to pave a new road unless it is absolutely forced to travel through the jungle. The effort is the trigger.
The resistance creates the growth.
So if we look at the architecture we've built so far,
Nice.
mindfulness and meditation act as the shield, protecting the hardware from the corrosive effects of cortisol and clearing the static in the working memory.
And neurobics acts as the gem, forcing the growth of new dendritic scaffolding and optimizing our conscious sensory processing.
We have effectively optimized the conscious mind.
But the sources introduce a massive paradigm shift here. The conscious mind is merely the tip of the iceberg.
A very, very small tip. If we truly want to unlock the kind of limitless, frictionless memory capacity these texts promise, we have to put on the scuba gear and dive into the deep, dark, and often illogical waters of the subconscious.
Because the conscious mind might be the one doing the reading, but the subconscious mind retains absolute veto power over what actually gets remembered.
This is the transition from the hard biology of memory into the deep psychology of memory.
To navigate this, the cognitive manuals break down the structural hierarchy of the mind into 3 layers: the conscious, the subconscious, and the unconscious.
Let's clearly define the boundaries of those layers.
The conscious mind is essentially your active working memory. It is the part of you that is awake, logical, and listening to this analysis right now. It processes the immediate sensory data.
But in terms of sheer processing power, it represents perhaps 5% of your total cognitive capacity.
Its primary job is to evaluate the external reality and pass the relevant data underwater to the much larger system.
The subconscious, which makes up the vast majority of the remaining 95%.
The subconscious is the massive high-speed storage vault. It processes millions of data points per second. It houses all of your automated behaviors, your deeply ingrained habits, your emotional baselines.
And most importantly for our discussion, your foundational beliefs and identity.
And the research points out that the vast majority of those foundational beliefs were hardwired into the system very early in life, typically before the age of 7.
Before age 7, a child's brain operates primarily in a theta brainwave state, which is essentially a state of deep hypnosis.
Children don't have the critical analytical filter of the conscious mind developed yet. They absorb every statement, every experience, and every emotional reaction from their environment, and accept it as absolute unvarnished truth.
Which fundamentally changes how we view memory failures as adults. The sources argue that the subconscious mind literally dictates our physical capacity to learn and remember, based entirely on those deeply rooted beliefs.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the subconscious operates as an uncompromising filter. It does not matter how hard the conscious mind tries to force a memory into storage.
If the subconscious holds a belief that contradicts the conscious effort, the subconscious wins the battle, every single time.
So imagine you are at a massive networking event. Your conscious mind, that 5%, is saying, I need to memorize the names of these 20 important people for my career.
You are trying to focus. But deep down, your subconscious is holding on to a belief formed when you were 8 years old, when a teacher publicly embarrassed you for forgetting an answer.
The subconscious belief is, I have a terrible memory. I am foolish when I try to remember things in public. What happens in the brain?
The subconscious will immediately perceive the networking event as a threat to your identity. Its job is to maintain the reality of its beliefs.
So it will actively block the conscious mind from encoding the names. It will flood the system with a microdose of anxiety, scrambling the working memory just enough to ensure you forget.
You will walk away from the conversation having forgotten the name in 3 seconds, not because your hippocampus is broken, but because your subconscious successfully ensured your reality matched your core belief.
It is a self-fulfilling prophecy, hardwired into the neurology. The conscious mind wants to learn, but the subconscious mind wants to protect the identity.
The texts use a visceral analogy of a professional baseball player to explain this trauma-blocking mechanism.
It is a brilliant illustration of fear-based conditioning. Imagine a highly skilled professional batter. During a game, an erratic pitch goes wild and strikes him violently in the face.
A massive physical trauma fused with extreme emotional shock.
Exactly. His conscious logical mind understands that it was a freak accident. The conscious mind knows the statistics and knows the pitcher didn't intend to do it.
But the subconscious mind doesn't do statistics. The subconscious mind instantly fused the specific visual image of a high inside pitch with agonizing pain and the threat of death.
The amygdala permanently tagged that specific trajectory as a mortal threat. Fast forward a few months, the batter is healed, he steps back up to the plate, and his hitting coach is trying to teach him a new conscious technique to hit that exact type of high inside pitch.
The conscious mind is eager to learn.
But the moment the pitcher winds up and releases a ball on that trajectory, the subconscious perceives the threat, overrides the conscious mind entirely, and triggers the fear response.
The batter flinches, steps back, and completely fails to execute the new technique.
The subconscious literally blocked the conscious mind from learning or reacting smoothly, essentially saying, I don't care about your batting average, and I don't care about the coach's instructions. I am protecting you from getting hit in the face again.
Painful, embarrassing, or negative emotional reactions act as an impenetrable brick wall against memorization. The subconscious is effectively acting like a massive, heavily armed bouncer at the velvet rope of the memory club.
That is the perfect operational metaphor.
Your conscious mind is out on the sidewalk, constantly trying to bring new VIP guests into the club, new facts, new names, a new language you're trying to learn.
But if you walk up to that door projecting negative self-talk or holding an internal ID that says I have a terrible memory, the bouncer takes one look, crosses his arms, and refuses entry.
The bouncer doesn't care how hard the conscious mind argues using logic. The bouncer only respects the VIP list of existing beliefs.
And you cannot bribe this bouncer with logic. You cannot argue your way past the subconscious because it does not process rational linguistic argument.
To get the new information into the club, you have to learn to speak the native language of the subconscious.
Which brings us to the ultimate hacking tools in these cognitive manuals. The bouncer only speaks two languages fluently: vivid, multisensory imagery, and present tense affirmation.
Let's dig into the first tool, visualization.
The entire premise of using visualization to enhance memory relies on a bizarre but scientifically proven biological quirk. The human brain struggles to distinguish between an actual physical experience and a vividly, deeply imagined one.
We all experience this quirk constantly. The classic example in the texts is the lemon test.
If I ask you to close your eyes and vividly imagine holding a bright yellow lemon, feeling the waxy, dimpled skin,
Bringing it up to your nose to smell the sharp citrus, and then taking a massive, aggressive bite right into the sour flesh.
if you imagine the juice hitting your tongue, your salivary glands will actually begin producing saliva.
Wait, I literally just salivated thinking about that right now. Your physical body initiates a biological digestive response to a piece of fruit that does not exist outside of your imagination.
The thought literally creates physical reality. This is why sports psychologists utilize visualization so heavily.
When they have an Olympic gymnast mentally rehearse a flawless routine, or a golfer mentally rehearse the perfect swing, they aren't just thinking positive thoughts.
fMRI scans show that as they imagine the movement, the exact same motor cortex networks fire in the brain as if they were actually performing the action.
By vividly imagining the perfect execution and fusing it with the emotional high of success, they are laying down the physical myelination and neural code for that movement before they ever step onto the mat.
The brain truly believes it has already succeeded.
The cognitive manuals provide incredibly specific instructions on how to weaponize this for memory retention. If you want to use visualization to remember a speech, or if you are trying to build a memory palace to store massive amounts of data, you cannot just casually sketch the image in your mind.
A fleeting thought won't trigger the neurobiology. You have to paint the image in thick, multisensory detail. Detail is the currency of the subconscious.
If your mental image involves walking down a cobblestone street to retrieve a piece of information, you must actively ask yourself, what do the stones feel like through the soles of my shoes? Is it raining? What does the wet stone smell like?
If you place a mental aquarium in the room to remind you of a fact, you need to visualize the exact neon hues of the fish and hear the bubbling of the filter.
And this leads to my absolute favorite insight from the sources, because it gives us clinical permission to be deeply weird.
Oh, totally. The manuals explicitly instruct the reader to let the subconscious run completely wild when creating these visual markers. They argue that there are no unacceptable images in the theater of your mind.
The deep subconscious is a primal engine. It does not understand societal taboos, politeness, or social boundaries. It operates on raw emotional resonance and shock value.
So if you are trying to memorize a dry list of historical facts, and your brain spontaneously generates completely absurd, bizarre, or even highly inappropriate mental image to connect the data points.
You are supposed to embrace it. You don't suppress the weird thought to be proper.
Not at all. The text suggests that letting your mind create shocking, taboo, or hilarious visual markers actually guarantees the memory will stick. The bouncer at the club loves the weird stuff. It breaks the monotony.
From a neurological standpoint, this is known as the von Riestorff effect, or the isolation effect, right?
Exactly. When an image is bizarre or shocking, it instantly engages the amygdala. The amygdala acts as a siren signaling the hippocampus. This data is highly unusual. It stands out from the baseline. Encode this immediately.
Normalcy is easily forgotten. The absurd is permanently filed.
So that handles the visual language.
Yeah.
The second tool to rewrite the VIP list and bypass the bouncer is affirmation.
And to be clear, the texts are not talking about the cheesy self-help cliche of smiling in the mirror and saying nice things.
No, this is framed as strategic psychological reprogramming. Affirmations are the systematic process of replacing the chronic negative self-talk that the bouncer is constantly overhearing.
Every time you casually say, "I'm terrible with names," or "my brain is turning to mush as I get older," you are cementing the bouncer's instructions to reject new memories.
You have to replace those destructive scripts with targeted positive statements.
Right.
But the absolute non-negotiable rule outlined in the manuals is that these affirmations must be constructed in the present tense.
The subconscious does not understand the future. If you say, "I will have a great memory next year," the subconscious files that away in a perpetual tomorrow. It never acts on it.
The statement must be, "My memory functions brilliantly right now," or "I'm capable of recalling anything I choose in this moment."
Which introduces a massive psychological hurdle. And the texts confront this head on. This raises an important question. What happens when you stand there, take a deep breath, and boldly declare, "I possess a flawless photographic memory"?
But you immediately hear a sarcastic little voice in the back of your head whisper, "That is an absolute lie. You spent 20 minutes looking for your car keys this morning."
The inner critic. The bouncer hears the grandiose claim, checks your internal history, realizes it's a lie, and laughs in your face.
Exactly. If your current self-image violently rejects the affirmation as a delusion, the affirmation will actually backfire.
It generates massive cognitive dissonance. You feel like a fraud, which increases your stress, which releases cortisol, which further damages your memory.
To bypass the DS detector, the experts and the sources recommend the bite-sized approach. You cannot force a massive lie into the system.
If your mind rejects the grandiose claim, you must dial the affirmation back until you find a statement that is undeniably positive, but that your subconscious actually finds believable.
You find the stepping stone. You use your mindfulness practice to observe the internal pushback. When you feel the resistance, you adjust.
Instead of claiming, "I have a perfect memory," you shift the phrasing to, "I am taking active daily steps to improve my focus."
Or, "I am learning the tools to remember names more effectively."
The inner critic can't argue with that. It's factually true.
And because it is true, the subconscious accepts it.
Yeah.
You begin to build a foundation of trust with your own mind. You are slowly rewriting the VIP list without triggering the alarm system.
So, what does this all mean? Am I just supposed to lie to myself until my brain believes it? Is this ultimately just a sophisticated version of fake it till you make it, dressed up in neurobiology?
It is not about lying to yourself. It is about the intentional architectural design of the psychological environment required for memory to thrive. Let's trace it back to the very beginning of our discussion.
Back to the cortisol.
Yes. If you constantly reinforce the belief that your memory is failing, you generate a perpetual state of low-grade anxiety. That anxiety ensures a steady drip of cortisol into the hippocampus, physically degrading the tissue.
The belief literally causes the physical damage.
Precisely. But by utilizing vivid, bizarre visualization and believable present tense affirmations, you are actively dismantling the anxiety. You are cultivating an internal state of emotional safety, novelty, and calm confidence.
You are lowering the stress response, and that specific neurochemical state, Low cortisol, high neurotrophins is the absolute biological prerequisite for neuroplasticity.
You are simply setting the optimal stage for the brain to do what it has evolved to do: grow, connect, and remember.
It all weaves together so perfectly. The psychological belief dictates the chemical environment, which dictates the physical structure of the hardware. We have traversed an immense amount of cognitive territory in this deep dive. Let me try to map out the journey we've just taken.
Please do.
We started by looking at the surface, acknowledging the rapid, chaotic river of our daily attention. We realized that if we want to encode anything into the hard drive, we have to pull ourselves out of the automated trance of mindlessness.
We use the deliberate practice of mindfulness to step out of the rapids and stand on the riverbank. We establish the observer, the baseline of focus.
From there, we moved to the physical conditioning. We use daily meditation to fortify the prefrontal cortex, allowing us to filter out the modern noise and actively lower the toxic flood of cortisol that physically destroys our hippocampus.
We clear the static and protect the machinery. That is the defensive protocol.
Then we transition to the offensive strategy. We take the brain to the gym with neurobics, we shatter our deeply rutted routines, we brush our teeth with our non-dominant hand, we walk new routes.
We create multi-sensory symphonies to force the massive release of BDNF. We actively grow the dense, branching safety net of dendrites to ensure our memories have multiple roads for retrieval.
We upgrade the physical wiring and build the cognitive reserve. And finally, having optimized the conscious mind, we hold our breath and dive into the massive hidden depths of the subconscious.
We meet the bouncer at the club of our identity. We accept that if our deep-seated beliefs are negative, the doors to memory remain locked.
But we learn how to hack the bouncer's VIP list by speaking his native language, using wildly vivid, multisensory, and delightfully taboo visualizations.
While slowly building trust through bite-sized, present-tense affirmations, it is a genuinely holistic paradigm. It conclusively proves that a powerful memory is not a parlor trick, and it is certainly not a fixed genetic trait.
It is a direct reflection of the overall health of your mental, emotional, and physical ecosystem. And that realization is the most empowering takeaway for anyone listening to this right now. Your memory is a dynamic, living, profoundly adaptable system.
It is continuously responding to how you treat it today, in this very moment. Whether you are 19 years old or 93 years old, the neuroplasticity remains. You hold the power to physically change the architecture of your own brain.
To close out our exploration today, we want to offer a final thought for you to carry with you, one that builds on the incredible power of the subconscious.
We established that your brain's biological machinery cannot effectively tell the difference between a deeply imagined memory and a physical reality. The motor cortex fires, the saliva flows.
Which means every single time you allow your mind to wander into a daydream, whether that is a vivid dream of a future success or a spiraling, anxious rehearsal of a worst-case scenario.
You are not just wasting time. You are actively writing permanent code into your brain's operating system. You are physically paving the neural pathways that will dictate your future reactions.
So the question you must ask yourself is, what reality are you programming into your memory right now? That is a staggering thought to walk away with. Thank you for taking this massive journey into the architecture of the mind with us.
It's been incredible.
I highly encourage you, the moment this ends, to go into your bathroom and try brushing your teeth with your wrong hand. Feel the chaos, feel the frustration, and know that in that exact moment, you are waking up dormant neurons. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and take care of that beautiful, adaptable brain of yours.